Welcome everyone to the third of our 4 SCI Connections meetings in 2022. We hold these quarterly, typically, and this is September. Our next one will be in December. And we like to give a quick update of what we're doing here at the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, but also spend some time in terms of communicating the projects that we take on and the status of them. And today we will be talking about the integrated knowledge translation project that we have. So I'm Jen French, the current president of the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium. Barry will be following me, our treasurer, along with our speakers today. So that's our quick agenda. Let's just give a quick update of NASCIC. So for those of you who are not familiar or new to the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, or as we say for short, NASCIC, we still formed in 2018 as a grassroots effort amongst those living with spinal cord injury and the organizations who represent them throughout North America. We have now passed the 400 mark of membership in this past quarter. We're really happy about that. Our memberships, we currently have 55 community-led organizations, over 270 individuals, but also very important to our membership as well are the 78 partner organizations. Those are various other stakeholders within the spinal cord injury community. We have made our mission broad, so we're really trying to achieve unified achievements in research, care, current cure, and policy in a collaborative effort throughout North America for the spinal cord injury community. And we made that mission broad for the sole purpose of making sure that we are flexible with the needs as they come about throughout North America. And we achieve our missions through identifying gaps, through communicating resources that inherently exist within our community, but also being a conduit of collaboration to have us all work together to have better achievements and to improve the lives of those living with spinal cord injury within North America. So with that, we encourage you to become a member. You can hit that QR code, or you can go to our website and go to membership and join. Membership is free. It's just a simple application, and we would love to have you join us into the various aspects of not just the meetings we have, the communications of resources and engagement. So to that end, I am going to hand it over to Barry Monroe to take over our program for today. Take it away, Barry.
Oh, thanks, Jen. I'm really happy to be part of a great crew here today, speaking on what we all really believe is a really important subject in our engagement in research. And we're going to hear first from Dr. Heather Gainforth, who is the principal investigator of integrated knowledge translation and guiding principles, and currently is with the UBC, University of British Columbia, Kelowna. And we're really thankful to have her here in the group that she's really a larger group that she's put together, and she can talk to us about her IKT principles. We also have John Chernesky, who's a head of consumer engagement program and manager of Praxis, this Praxis. And John is, again, another leader, frankly, internationally in pushing for consumer engagement and research, and we're looking forward to what he has to say. And of course, this is a worldwide phenomenon, and we're very grateful to have our friend Antonio Vecchio, who is up very early in the morning down in Australia from Melbourne, who is also the Community and Consumer Engagement Manager for Spinal Research Institute. With all that said, I'd like to then now move it over to Heather, and who's going to take it off. All yours.
It's stupid. It looks really when you
Post my mute them.
Good. I'm just gonna, can I just ask everyone to please mute while the presentation is going on? Thank you.
And then I just need ability to share my screen.
You should be good to share now. Let me know.
All right, here we go. Can you see my slides? I'm looking for some nods. Yeah, awesome. Okay, well, it's lovely to see everyone. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time today. This session actually builds on a session that we had at ISCWA. So hopefully maybe some of you joined us because you saw our poster along the way, where we're really trying to go from talking about the idea of engagement to really getting to where the rubber meets the road. And that was Kim Anderson's idea of a title, which I really love. So how do we actually get really practical about what meaningful engagement looks like in spinal cord injury research? And so with that, my presentation is about really researching with integrity. So how do we go from principles to strategies, the actual things that let you follow the IKT guiding principles? And we'll talk a little bit about that more. Before I move forward, I want to make sure that I take this time to acknowledge the land that I'm coming to you from. So I'm based here in British Columbia on the traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. And if you are not familiar with Canada's really dark and shameful history of how we've treated Indigenous people in our country, you might not know that on September 30th, it is Canada's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, where we actually speak the truth about the legacy and damage of residential schools in Canada. Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their homes and put in residential schools. And those schools created a lot of trauma and damage and death. And also intergenerational trauma. So it's a really important week here in Canada. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada has 94 calls to action, and there is even an action specific to research. So Call 65 talks about establishing a national research program with multi-year funding to advance the understanding of reconciliation. How do we actually come to a place where people are treated with dignity and respect, and that we actually reconcile the harms of our past? And I actually think that not only is that incredibly important as a Canadian to recognize, but also really important in thinking about what does meaningful engagement look like in spinal cord injury, but also what does meaningful engagement look like beyond spinal cord injury with other communities that are often tokenized, including Indigenous communities here in Canada and maybe on the lands in which you are on today. So I hope you take some time to think about maybe whose land you are on today. So with that, let's get to what we're speaking about today, of this idea of integrity, of what meaningful engagement looks like. So I'll provide a very quick overview of what our guiding principles are. We've chatted lots about the guiding principles. It was really exciting to see that picture from Miami in 2018 when NASCIC started, because it was at that meeting that we actually decided that the guiding principles would be a key NASCIC project. And since then, we've come a long way. But then I want to talk about how do we actually cultivate a practice of meaningful engagement. What's our partnership doing? And then Barry and John and Antonio will take it away and tell you about some of the amazing work they're doing as well. So let's get to this idea of integrity. So our partnership has used the definition from Brene Brown a number of times in our presentations. So integrity, that idea that you have to choose courage over comfort. You have to choose what's right over what's fun, fast, or easy, although we often say that it is really fun and sometimes can be easier to do partnership. But the key part about this definition I really want to highlight is this idea that integrity is choosing to practice our values rather than simply professing them. So going that one step further of really thinking about what does it mean to follow the principles. So we have 8 principles of integrated knowledge translation, and I can give you many resources of how you can find out how we developed these principles. But the principles essentially are that. They're our values. They're the norms. They're the rules, they're beliefs about what we think is either desirable or positive for a person or a group or an organization, community to do. So when we're thinking about research partnership, they tell us about the rightfulness and the wrongfulness of our actions. They don't really tell us how to actually do them. And that's where we're going to get to today and talk a little bit more about that. If you want to learn more about what those principles actually are, you want to read them, you can go to our website. There's a one-pager there that gives you all the definitions. And you can also check out our publication in Archives of Physical Medicine. It's open access, and you can access it whether you're at a university or not. So with that, how do we actually go from integrity? Go for integrity, I guess, from principles to strategies. And our partnership always talks about this idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. So we've asked this question: if we want people to follow the guiding principles, how do we transform the spinal cord injury research system so that it can actually support meaningful engagement and combat tokenism? It's not enough to continue to ask people to truly engage. We need to support it. So in terms of getting to integrity, I wanted to highlight 3 areas that our partnership is working in right now. So 1, we're trying to build capacity, both around researchers and research users, and understand how we can build capacity. 2, we're helping to think about how do we actually establish partnerships and what happens when those partnerships are established? And then how do we maintain them? What are the principles and the strategies that high quality partnerships are using? So let's start with this idea of building capacity, and I'll tell you very briefly what we've been working on. So the first thing we did is we learned from experts. We looked at champions of spinal cord injury research, and we wanted to understand what makes a champion of spinal cord injury research and meaningful engagement. What brought them to who they are today? How did we actually establish people that can do this? We found some key things in these articles. So 1 was this promotion of an attitudinal shift to co-production, where they valued co-production maybe alongside or over and above just the curiosity-driven questions they might have had. They had role models. They had key role models that showed them what it looked like to be a partnered researcher or a partnered research user. And those role models were inspiring them and others to do work in this way. They had intrinsic motivation for engagement. So it was really about who they were, their enjoyment of it, and transactional approaches that if you don't take the partnered approach, we won't support you, didn't work particularly well. So we needed to avoid carrot and sticking people into doing things, and rather appealing to people's identity as researchers and research users that took an engaged approach. And then we also need to foster relational partnership skills. So partnering is a skill. It's not something we're just born being able to do. We need to work on those skills and help build those skills. And Barry's going to talk about that a little bit more today. We also interviewed SCI researchers from a preclinical stream all the way into a clinical stream, and then out to community-based, what I call backyard scientists, about why they couldn't follow the IKT guiding principles and why it's difficult for them to take a partnered approach. And we see from our research to date that there's work that needs to be done to build capacity at an individual level, at a relational level, and at an institutional level. What we really hear is that researchers feel like they are swimming upstream when we come to partnered research. They need more how-to information, but they also need a way to connect and network with other researchers who take a partnered approach, but also with other research users who are interested in a partnership approach. And at the institutional level, they need a system that values, that resources, that incentivizes research partnerships. Right now, it can be very difficult for them to take a research partnership approach in their institutions or getting funding for that partnered approach. So in terms of building capacity, what are we doing? On that how-to approach, we've got the webinars, the manuscripts, postcards, mailing lists, but we are working to create more and more tools and resources to help researchers. We're working on creating a toolkit, thinking about apps and networking opportunities to actually create those connections, and also thinking about how we share more stories of partnership so we can see more role models and understand what they're doing. We've also done a series of videos alongside many other community partnered researchers from across Canada in this case with the Inclusive Society. So that means that those resources are available in French and in English, and they tell the story of partnered research across both of those, across many different partnered approaches. And so I would encourage you to visit our website and check out the different things. There's stuff being added all of the time. Barry's going to tell you more about how our partnership and how NASCIC in particular is working to build a capacity. But in terms of establishing a partnership, we're thinking in those ideas and starting to get to an idea of how can we go there. But the key thing about building a partnership that we would always encourage people to think about is, who are your research users? So for any research question, who are the individuals or the groups that would benefit from the research, where the research would be relevant, useful, or usable to them? And these groups are often different than the research participant. So you might be interested from a curiosity perspective in the value of peer mentorship. And yes, people with spinal cord injury are a research user, but peer mentorship is often delivered by major organizations like Spinal Cord Injury BC. And so it would be wise to think about partnering with an organization that can actually implement your findings and give some feedback in that sense. So really spending time thinking about, do I have the right research user for my project? From there, we're also starting to ask the question, how can we connect researchers and research users more easily and make sure that both the researcher and the research user have the capacity to come to that conversation in a way that they already know about the guiding principles and they already know about partnering and meaningful engagement. And Barry will talk about that more. So let's get to this idea of maintaining partnerships. This is where I think we go from principle to strategy and think about integrity. So I told you already that principles are about the fundamental norms, rules, beliefs. Essentially, I always say principles live between your two ears and they live in your heart. You can't see principles. They're something you commit to, but your strategies and your practices and the way in which you go about your partnerships, those are observable. If I took out a video camera, I'd be able to see what you're doing. And that's how we actually get to the principles. So it becomes really important not just to think about principles, but to think about the strategies of partnered research and what researchers and research users are doing when they partner well together. So if we go back to those papers that I told you about earlier, where we spoke to the champions, we did try to understand what the principles and strategies they were using in their research. And we came up with a long list of strategies that they were using, and we tried to link those back to principles. So the strategies that we extracted from that were put into 6 categories. This work was led by Femke Hoekstra and is published in Evidence and Policy, so you can get access to this. And those strategies spell the word recipe. So resources and time, engagement strategies in the research process, the communication activities and methods that they used, the initiatives that they did in terms of their collaborative meetings, conferences, or events, how they initiated their partnerships, their strategies for that, and how they ensured representation, and then any education or training within that partnership. So for example, we see things like co-writing grants, their informal meetings, how they did brainstorming, how they actually outlined their roles and their responsibilities. And in that work, as well as in an open access blog post that you can get via our website, we actually link the recipe strategies to different example principles. Our partnership is going above and beyond that, but I think this is a good place to start. If you're looking for an even longer list of strategies that you could pick and choose from, because every partnership is different, we do have a really long list. So the really long list is available in our open access review of reviews on partnerships. So we reviewed 86 reviews of research partnership, and we pulled the principles, the strategies, the outcomes, and the impacts used. And in that particular project, we found 11 overarching strategies. Now, more recently, I've tasked our graduate students here at UBCO to bring together our long list of strategies across all these different projects to essentially create a pantry for recipes, different strategies you can use in partnered research. So that pantry piece, we brought that together back to our partnership. And what we've actually started to create is an IKT Guiding Principles toolkit that essentially gives you the recipe book for partnership. It's not going to tell you how to mix things necessarily perfectly, but it's going to give you some good ideas of how you can enact strategies and principles in your partnership. And we're working towards that at the moment. That said, the ingredients pantry list. I did ask the grad students to make sure that we have that up and available on our website sometime next week, so that if you just want the long list of strategies you could pick from and you wanted access to that, we'll make sure that gets on the website within the week. And I will tweet that from our Twitter. So make sure you pay attention to the contact information at the end. So what do you do if you want to start today and haven't given you enough information? Because we're constantly trying to advance the science of partnership, but it is a lot of time and effort. It takes time to keep giving more and more strategies and tools, but we're working towards it. So if you want to start today, you've likely seen me talk about these 4 steps before. So what does it look like to follow each principle for you or for your partnership? Spend some time reflecting and thinking about that. Use the principles to set clear boundaries with yourself and with your partners. What's okay? What's not okay? How do you plan to see and stop tokenism? And what are you going to do when something happens that's not okay? Because I guarantee you, at some point in your partnership, something won't work. My partnerships aren't perfect. Nobody's relationships are perfect at every moment in the day. And so you will need to have a process to help hold yourself accountable and your partners accountable for supporting meaningful engagement and to call each other in and out when things aren't working. Lastly, I would ask you to reflect, iterate, and report on your process and outcomes. So we can't advance the science of partnership and advance research partnerships if no one tells us how they're partnering. But I also want you to think about self-assessing. So we're working on trying to create more evaluation tools and methods for partnership. But in the meantime, if you just think about a self-assessment, so in this project or in this grant for each principle, are our partners developing and maintaining relationships based on trust, respect, dignity, and transparency? You can go from like 1, strongly disagree, to 10, strongly agree. And think to yourself, I think in this partnership, it feels like a 6 right now on that particular principle. Okay, the 6 doesn't really matter. People will go, oh no, we didn't get a 9 or a 10. I don't think that the 6 matters, but I think what you're going to do to take that from a 6 to a 10 does. So starting to have conversations either in your own head with yourself or in the partnerships that you're in, that you would say, actually, in this grant, in terms of partners sharing and decision-making, we feel like a solid 5 right now. How are we going to get to a 7? How are we going to get to a 9? Doesn't have to be perfect, but how are we going to push things forward? And I think that's why I always say that a rising tide lifts all boats. And that is the statement of our partners and the work that we do. So we want to make sure that by improving the quality of SCI research partnerships, whether that's from a 2 to a 4 or a 4 to a 10, that we can rise the tide and we can lift the boats. We can stop tokenism in spinal cord injury research, and we can make sure that research is relevant, useful, and usable to people with spinal cord injury. There's a lot of researchers, funders, research users, organizations, students, trainees, amazing people that let us do the work we're doing. So I have to make sure I take some time to thank them. And if you are hoping to follow our Twitter and our website to get that long strategy pantry list, that is our contact information there. So with that, I'll stop sharing and pass it over to Barry, who's really going to tell you about how we're building, and NASCIC is building capacity for researchers and research users to partner. So thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Jessica, if you can tee that up, that'd be great. And as Heather said, you've heard the word a lot through Heather's presentation about capacity building. And really, that's the crux of the issue that we faced a few years ago when we at NASCIC decided, and representing the community, where is it that there's the biggest gaps in our world between what we need as people with lived experience and what the rest of the world is providing us. And frankly, the issue around research was this gap of us not feeling like we're part of the system or contributing in a true partnership way, the way we'd like to. And, you know, we got to listen to what the title of this webinar is, When Rubber Hits the Road. It's really about practicalities and what can we actually, instead of just theory, practically implement. And we've had the good grace of Heather and her team providing the science behind how to transfer knowledge, and with the beginnings of practical tips, especially in the research community, we felt that it was incumbent upon us at NASCIC to turn around and provide the tools that are necessary to build capacity within our own community. So after examining other groups, other indications and other people of other conditions, we found that many people, many organizations out there have developed some type of course development in teaching their community about the research continuum and the research enterprise. And the whole objective of that was to really have them more engaged and to build that capacity. So next slide. So what we decided to do was build a course with a project goal to basically engage individuals whose participation in research is hindered by lack of knowledge. People lack confidence if they're sitting in a room full of scientists potentially, or they could be social scientists or neuroscientists. It doesn't matter. If you're from a lay background, you might not want to speak your own truth. And it's really about getting the opinion of a spinal cord injured person there. You're not there to be an expert in whatever the discipline is, whether it's neuroscience or it's quality of life issues. It's really about your being an expert in spinal cord injury where you can contribute. We want to increase the knowledge of the research process by that with the SCI community through their resources and training. So we can slowly build and really amp up that whole knowledge base for the individuals. And we wanted to organize and educate researchers and healthcare providers who are interested in what we call consumer engagement. And forgive me, we use the word consumer. There's also what they call patient engagement. And I apologize to our listeners that really it's about the person with lived experience, but that's the catchphrase that they use and the norm and culture in that world and across the spectrum of SCI research and care. So it goes beyond just research. It's also about care. Bottom line is that the more that the people with lived experience are involved in the process, the chances of better research will come out, which will then increase the chances of better standards of care. The best research creates the best standards of care potentially, and that's what we want to do. And then we also wanted as a goal to facilitate the placement of individuals. It's not just enough for us to help people build a knowledge base around research and feel comfortable in research. We got to be able to bridge them and bring them together with the research community who are looking for people to do that. And next slide. So our objectives were simple, really. Building an online SCI research advocacy course, and then matchmaking and helping with clinical trial recruitment. And then thirdly, looking at how we can go beyond the course and have some live instructor-led programs, be it virtually or in person, and potentially with other conferences, so that people who really wanted to go down that SCI research rabbit hole can have the opportunity to really hone their skills and build a knowledge base. Next slide. So the importance of education, you heard me talk about this already. Education is power and knowledge is power. And if we want to be empowered and be part of the system, we really need to get our capacity built in, and we need to build that knowledge from behind and do that. Years ago, when it was decided to go down this road and to really put together this program, we at NASCIC heard from many people throughout North America, and the message was very clear. We want to be part of the process, but more importantly, it wasn't going to be a bitch fest, excuse me for that. But the problem is we didn't want people just complaining about the process. We wanted people in the process to help build the partnerships with researchers and research bodies, the way Heather spoke of earlier. This is about a positive change based on positive principles, based on positive knowledge, so that we can really make things even better. And that's the whole idea. And the goal of the course is to empower people. And that's all we wanted to do. With knowledge comes power. It gives us the ability to be confident and speak our truth. And that's what we were trying to do. And that's what we believe in with the importance of education. How are we doing that? We're learning from the leading voices in the SCI research community. We've actually invited many individuals around in terms of our working group, have put together all walks of life, from people with lived experience to researchers, neuroscientists, to neurosurgeons and clinicians, of course, and anybody else that might be related to the SCI world, all giving their input. And it's been very important. We beta test our modules as they're being built, and we're getting that feedback. And what you'll see, once the product is built, you'll see many interviews of people with lived experience, as well as others who within our community who can speak to the various topics as we go throughout the modules. Next slide. So these are the 12 modules that we have right now. And I just wanted to give you just a bit of a brief look at this. And I want to let you know that, frankly, these 12 modules really do capture everything. They do. And I know you might think that's impossible. And sometimes the titles might not be what you wanted to see, because there is a difference in our world in the opinion of what is considered arguably regeneration, neural repair, replacement, cell replacement. Those kind of things, they get caught in this regardless. So module 1, we have an introduction. Module 2 is really understanding the research process and how R&D works with the decision makers, be it through devices or pharmaceuticals. People need to understand how things get through academia, how they get through industry, and how they get regulatory approval from the government. They need to understand that. But it's all done in lay terms. So modules 1 and 2, by the way, are available as teasers on our piece. We're not producing the whole set of modules of the course until the course is completely built, and then we can do it all at once. We have addressing historical challenges in SCI studies. People need to understand that SCI is not an easy thing to study. We're very heterogeneous. We're a different lot, and we stand alone in terms of science and how to do things. So there are nuances that people need to understand. Frankly, one of my favorites is module 4 and 5 is really the SCI biology. That breaks down explaining what a spinal cord is, what a spinal cord injury is, what's the mechanism of injury, and why it's a problem to solve. And explains that in lay terms. Module 5 then kind of takes us to the next step. It talks about aging, but it's really about secondary complications too. These are the things that really affect everybody with SCI and everybody around them with SCI over the years, and things that could be preventable or things we need to tackle when it comes to better treatment and research. Module 6 is neuroprotection. Module 7, cell replacement. Module 8, regeneration, neural repair. I call these kind of the heavy neuroscience ones. But again, in lay terms, they're there for people to understand. Now, module 9, retraining and neuroplasticity. That includes things like activity-based therapy, as well as neuromodulation, which we're all very kind of caught up on right now. And it's kind of a hot ticket that everybody's talking about. Then we have to address, really, when we say research, it's not just neuroscience, it's all research. So quality of life research has to be examined. Now, that could be a whole course in itself, but we wanted to make people aware of the topics that are out there and how they can contribute in that area of research. Module 11, this is a very different type of module, but very important, that we felt that we needed to also help educate researchers on SCI. And so they have a good understanding of not something just reading a textbook, but quality of life issues, the day in the life of some of the spinal cord injury, especially if they're designing studies. They need to understand what our days are like and what we go through and what the pitfalls are, the ups and downs. They need to understand that. And this is also brought to you by many interviews and people speaking to the topics directly. And it's going to be exciting once this gets out, because I think the research committee will really take that on, as well as the whole course. And module 12, that's the one where we say, now you've basically gone through this course. Here are the opportunities that you can be an advocate with. And we provide the many opportunities via NASCIC, but more importantly, opportunities outside of NASCIC, like other organizations are providing. What we need to understand, and what the world needs to understand, is that the funders are now mandating. They're going down the road of mandating the representation of people with lived experience when it comes to applying for a grant. They will not look at a grant unless there is a representation of a person with lived experience on that grant committee or the team that's applying for the grant. Now, that said, we are trying to get away from tokenism. And Heather spoke to that, and we speak to that inside of this course as well, that we want people to have meaningful engagement when they're in that setting, not just there as a box that got checked off an hour before the grant deadline was due. So that's it's in a nutshell. Our target date is approximately, next slide, please, the end of the year. And as we said, you can visit the course webpage here and as well preview the modules 1 and 2 to give you a flavor for what's going on. And the next slide is basically, we also talk about matchmaking. I want everybody to know that we will be there to facilitate people wanting to get involved in research. And really, as important, researchers looking for people that they want as advocates on their teams. So we'll be playing that role of putting two people together. And frankly, it's not just a matter of just straight matching. You have to look at someone's qualifications and their resume, where there's a better fit, what they want to sit in on, and the area of research that they want to be part of, where that could be, you know, they can have much more of a meaningful engagement and feel more comfortable in their ways. We can't also ignore that we also have SCItrials.org, which is a database program that's available for people that are interested in getting involved in research, where it's been created to provide a profile, as well as you can regionally and look anywhere in the world for trials that are found with people with lived experience. So you have that opportunity too. So this is all available and will all be part of our rollout in the new year. Next slide. Thank you. That's it from my end. And I pass it over now to my friend, John Trineski, Consumer Engagement Program Manager for Praxis.
Thanks, Barry. All right, so I'll pick up from where, Heather sort of talked about the foundational ideas behind partnered research, and Barry's now showing you how they're working to build capacity amongst people working in spinal cord injury research, not just individuals with lived experience, but also researchers and clinicians that want to partner with them to work in meaningful and effective partnerships. As Barry mentioned, more and more research funders are requiring that these partnerships be part of the grant application. And as an individual who works for a research funder and has reviewed more grant applications than I care to mention, there seems to be a piece that researchers and people that are submitting these grant applications still need a bit of help with. So what we're going to talk about today is how you can develop a really powerful engagement plan in your grant application. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I think Heather did a fantastic job of explaining Canada's terrible history with Indigenous populations, so I won't go into more detail on that. Just looking forward to Truth and Reconciliation Day here in Canada in a couple of days, as we move to acknowledge the truths of everybody that has suffered over these years. Also, Barry mentioned terminology around patient or consumer. You can see my title is Consumer Engagement Program Manager. We're going to be changing. We're moving away from consumer. I think there's some negative connotations there. We'll soon be known as the PLEX program, which PLEX is an acronym for persons with lived experience. And so look forward to that coming in the next little while. Next slide, please. So before we get started, I want to just ground us on what research looks like. Jess, maybe you just walk through this slide. So if you're a researcher and you have a brilliant idea, you want to create the world's greatest wheelchair. So you decide, I need to put a team together. We know research isn't done by individuals, so who are you going to bring in? Well, you got to bring in maybe a physiotherapist. You might also want to bring in an occupational therapist, probably bring in an engineer, maybe an equipment vendor, perhaps even a manufacturer. But there's one person missing from that equation, and that's the individual who uses a wheelchair 16, 18 hours a day. When you start to think about individuals with lived experience as part of your team, as any other valuable member of a research project, it starts to change your thinking that this isn't just a tokenistic position you bring in because you're being told to do so, but they're as valuable in their perspective and expertise as anybody else you would bring into this team. Next slide, please. So when we think about your average grant application, there's sort of some standard components that are included within a grant application. So obviously you're going to have a section on the background. What's the research problem? What's the significant or relevant? And how ready is your group to actually undertake this work? You're going to have a project description. What's your hypothesis? What are your specific aims and goals and objectives? And what's the research design going to look like? What's your approach? What's your methodology? What's the feasibility of actually conducting this research? You're also going to put together a work plan. Who are your personnel? Who are your key personnel? You probably put in a Gantt chart showing the timeline of activities, as well as a budget and how you plan to evaluate your work. You might also want to include a knowledge translation plan. You know, what's the translational potential of this work? Who's going to take it up after you've done your phase, your part of the work? And how are you going to disseminate it? What are these KT activities and how is this work going to have impact? You may also want to put in a regulatory strategy if you're planning to bring a product to market. But this is this new piece that we're talking about, this engagement plan or lived experience consultation plan. I've reviewed many of them. Some of them have been good, most of them not quite so good. So I did a lot of searching. I read a lot of papers. I talked to a lot of experts in the area and came together with some real simple fundamental elements that you're going to want to add and include in an engagement plan that you're going to put into any future grant applications. So what are these key components of an engagement plan that you're going to want to put in? First, you're going to want to list the names, lived experience, and the secondary qualifications of your partners. A lot of people living with spinal cord injury aren't one-trick ponies. They're not just there, and their greatest asset isn't just their lived experience. They may have other expertise and qualifications that you can leverage in your work. We'll get into more detail on each of these as we move forward through the slides. So I won't go into too much detail right now. You're also going to explain why they were selected as partner and add some details of your existing relationship. Detail at which phases of the project they have or will be involved and at what level of influence. Provide a detailed timeline of those engagement activities and what the scope of work is going to look like. Again, a detailed budget for all engagement activities and compensation for partners. I will say, having spoken to pretty much every funder that funds anything in spinal cord injury, a budget to cover engagement costs is something a funder would never cut. So you can feel safe in putting together a robust budget. It strengthens your application, it doesn't hinder it. And then lastly, explain how your engagement activities will be monitored and evaluated. Again, always looking at quality improvement. Next slide, please. So when we talk about all phases of the research project, you know, we're talking about from the outset. This is from a postcard that Heather, myself, and a few others developed for ISCOS back in Sydney, Australia, a number of years ago. There was sort of a stopgap until the IKT principles were developed, but it's still relevant today, you know, and we talk about engagement starting early and often. From the outset of the research question, if you have people you can engage with in trying to define the question, right from the outset, you know, you're really going to be setting yourself up for success. And thinking about how you can engage throughout the research process, not just at one phase or two phases, but think about what that engagement is going to look like throughout the process. Next slide. Now, this is a really powerful tool created by the International Association of Public Participation. It's called the Spectrum of Engagement. And you can find the link at the bottom. We'll share these slides in case you haven't seen this before. But it really is a foundational tool for any form of engagement. And really, when I first saw this, I looked at this, you know, going from inform up to empower and the increasing impact on decision-making that these various phases of the spectrum have. And I originally thought, oh, we want to aim for empower all the time. We should be empowering. And I've come to realize over the years, no level of engagement is better than any other. They're tools to use in your toolbox at different points in the research process, right? Me personally, I'm not a big data guy. I don't want to get nitty gritty into the data analysis. You know, maybe just keeping me informed while you're analyzing data is all that I want. And this is the conversations you can have with your partners from the outset, is how do they want to be engaged? Maybe they're data hounds. Maybe they have an expertise in data and they can really help you there and you can collaborate at that phase. You know, that's going to be unique to each partnership. But yeah, talk with your partners, figure out what engagement's going to work best for your entire project team at different phases throughout the project. Next slide, please. So when we get into part one, right, list the names, experience, and secondary qualifications of your partner. You know, I see a lot of grant applications where they say, you know, this person's great, they're a Paralympian and they're a motivational speaker and they're the best person with a spinal cord injury I could get on my team. And you think, well, yeah, but you're doing a research into neuropathic pain. Do they have neuropathic pain? Do they have any experience with neuropathic pain? Is this research question even relevant to them? It's great that they're a motivational speaker and you know, you see them on the news all the time, but what relevant information or knowledge or experience do they have to this research question? So it goes beyond just the age, the sex and gender, time of since injury and level and severity of injury. But thinking about, do they have some professional credentials or designations that are relevant to your research? Are they connected to the SCI community? Are they a member of NASCIC, or do they connect with their local SCI community? Do they have that inbuilt network that's going to help in recruitment and dissemination and various other parts of the research? Do they have experience previously as a research participant or a research partner? Have they taken the NASCIC research advocacy course, and do they have these skills that are ready to apply? And also look at their pre-injury experiences. A lot of people have had, you know, tremendous professional careers prior to their injury and may not be doing that currently, but still have that inbuilt knowledge base. So think about it from a holistic approach. Why are they the right person to be on your team, and why did you bring them in? And share that with the grant reviewers in your grant application. Next slide. And again, now explain why they were selected as partners and details of the existing relationship. So, you know, I don't, you know, if I'm reviewing a grant and it doesn't tell me how you know them, how you connected with them, what this relationship is, I'm not entirely sure that they didn't just sign off on the grant application the night before. You know, it's great to know that they were a part of, that there's somebody you've worked with before, or you have a relationship in some form. And that can also provide some insight to a reviewer. You know, oftentimes clinician researchers will just go to one of their patients and say, hey, you want to be a part of my research project? And that's a great opportunity. It's a great way to connect. But there's often a power imbalance in that clinical patient relationship. And you want to try to move away from that into an equal partnership. So getting away from necessarily always having that clinical clinician-patient relationship. But talk about how their lived experience is relatable to this project. If the project's about, you know, muscle spasticity, maybe they can tell you about, you know, a little bit about their experience with spasticity. You know, what will they do to create added value through their networks, through their various other skills and qualifications? Why do they have an invested interest in this project? You know, if this is something that's their, you know, if it's, as I said, about spasticity, if spasticity is their number one concern in terms of secondary complications, they're probably a perfect partner for this, and they probably have a highly invested interest in the outcomes of the research. Talk about how long you've known them, how you connected, and potentially previous collaborations. So really try to add some color to this relationship. Next slide. Now, this is where we get into some of the important pieces. This is where it really starts to paint the picture of how you're planning to work with them, right? So talk about at which phases of the project they have, again, talking in the pretense, because if you're doing it in a really sort of gold star way, you will have engaged them before the application ever got written up. They will have likely been helping you to define what the research question is going to be and what the research methodology is going to look like. So you can actually talk about some of the engagement that's actually already happened prior to your grant application, and then map out what's going to be happening in the future if you're successful in securing funding. So, you know, talk about when and how their input will be solicited and incorporated. You know, list out example research activities and the corresponding engagement activities you plan to undertake. Again, as I said, pre-submission engagement activities as well, and what level of influence they had on that. If they really did help you design the research methodology and talk to you about the burden of participation and why the initial model of the research was going to be hard to recruit for, and you adapted it because of that input, that's something you want to share, right? Again, clarify the level of engagement from the IAP2 spectrum at various phases. Anybody that's reviewing these grant applications from a lived experience perspective will likely be quite familiar with IAP2, so it's a very powerful tool to use. Explain what supports will be provided. Are you going to provide them training, accommodations? and how you're going to support their travel. And again, detail how all of the input from your partners is going to influence your decisions. Now, again, much like any other grant application, you put together a Gantt chart showing where you're going to do what you're going to do over the course of the grant. You can put that into your engagement application as well. Talk about what you've done in that pre-submission phase. Map out when you're going to have your touch points throughout the various years of the project. And again, what you're going to do in terms of end of grant activities, publications, lay language summaries, all of that. This is a really great snapshot that you can put into your grant applications that will tell a reviewer, look, we've thought about this, we have a plan, we've mapped it out, these are the activities we plan to undertake, we're all on board with this, here's our roadmap, and it really does add value to your application. Next slide. Now, again, budgeting. This link here from the University of Manitoba, the Center of Healthcare for Innovation. It's far and away the best granting or budgeting tool that I've seen. There's a lot of them out there. You may find better ones. I love this one because it really does take you through. It's a beautiful Excel spreadsheet, and it takes you through all of the various activities and the associated costs you may encounter in your engagement activities. You can just enter in the figures you want. It has formulas built into it to auto calculate everything for you. And putting together a really robust budget like this as a supplementary document or resource within your engagement application or engagement plan for your grant application really does, again, reinforces that we've thought this through. We know what it's going to cost. We know what we're going to do. And it's all laid out right there in clear black and white. Next page. And then lastly, and I can't really emphasize this enough, how is your engagement going to be monitored and evaluated? We're in an evolving phase of developing the science of engaging people with lived experience. And the more that it's evaluated, the more that people publish on it, the more we can advance the science and become more robust in our methodologies. So, thinking first right off the hop, how will you ensure that it's going to be meaningful and assess its impact? First and foremost, who's your key person responsible for this engagement? It's always important to assign this and have somebody being responsible in terms of, making sure that you schedule out these meetings, that you make sure that all pre-meeting materials are provided and that any training or supports are there, that, the outputs and costs and time are being compensated for. Just make sure that you've got a key point person, ensuring that, appropriate and timely communication happens. Again, managing conflict and conflict resolution, who will ensure that appropriate accommodations are made in terms of accessibility, or whatever factors that your partner might require accommodations for. Again, assessing the impact of the engagement. And then I can't stress this benefit again enough. When you do partnered research, not only do you get to publish on the research you actually conducted, but you also get to publish on the engagement. There's a lot of journals, the BMJ particular has made multiple calls for publications on engagement activities. So for researchers that are always being pushed to publish more and more, it automatically provides you another opportunity to publish. Talk about which journals you will target. As again, I just said the BMJ. And this last piece is a great tool. This is the patient engagement and research scale. It's a validated tool created here in BC by Cleon Hamilton. It's really a fantastic tool that you and your partners can use to walk through and assess how effective your engagement has been and take the opportunity to learn lessons so you can do it better next time around. Next slide. That's my closing message. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. If you build out a really strong engagement plan, it creates a roadmap. It's almost like step-by-step instructions, and it'll make all of your engagement activities throughout the span of the grant that much easier to undertake. And that's it for me. I'll hand over to Antonio.
Thank you, John, and good morning, evening, for depending where we are in the world. My name's Antonio. Some of you may have met me, some of you may have not. So I do a very similar job to John in Australia, and basically I've been tasked with developing our consumer engagement program here in Melbourne, but mostly across Australia as well. So next slide, please. So a bit about the organisation. So essentially we were developed with the idea of collaboration, and a lot of our programs are reflective of that. So we do believe in partnership. We believe in people working together to generate positive outcomes for people with spinal cord injuries. So next slide, please. As acknowledged, I won't spend too much time on this, but we've acknowledged that it is a changing landscape in research, that the way things have been done for many, many years, where, and I do use the word consumer, so apologies for that with anyone, but the way the consumers were engaged, they were either research participants, and that's pretty much it. They may have been the beneficiaries of research without knowing, but not actually understanding how the decision-making process was made. So, we acknowledge that this is a changing space, and hopefully through these conversations and the principles that we are moving in the right direction. So next slide, please. Part of that as well is, we talk about avoiding tokenism, and part of that does come from an organizational level, and it has to be an organizational commitment to change, as well as making sure that each program has that commitment in it. Next slide, please. So in our program, we launched a consumer engagement program in August 2020, where I was hired rather than a consultancy service. So many organizations do engage consumers, but they are volunteers and on steering committees that potentially don't get paid. So next slides, please. So the main thing I want to talk about today is the development of our remuneration policy. So it is a big issue, not just in Australia, but when I talk to people overseas, we want to get people with lived experience involved, but to avoid tokenism, we need to ensure that they're paid. So we developed a remuneration policy, and was one of the first things that I did in my role. So once again, embedding it into our programs. So anything that is now established, we can offer remuneration. We adopted it from the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre model, and I'll elaborate on that shortly. So basically, I did a ring around and did a bunch of searches of organisations in the state and in the country to see how they reimburse, or if they reimburse consumers, and how they develop that engagement, and to see if there was a standard in Australia. And part of that as well is acknowledging the different ways consumers can contribute to the organisation. So next slide, please. The challenges that we faced was a lack of consistency, as I mentioned. They're in Australia and across your jurisdictions as well. There is no standard for how consumers are reimbursed. It is generally taking place at an organisational level. So there's no mandate from government or funding bodies, for example. The other one is to ensure that financial payments that people receive do not financially affect them. So things like if they're receiving an insurance or government payment, so here they're generally paid fortnightly periods, that if we were to give them money, that those payments were not going to be at jeopardy, and that's a real big deterrent for people. It's like, well, I don't want to get involved because I have that fear of I'm going to lose my ongoing payments moving forward. And the other thing is that it needed to be a flexible program. We needed to be engage people at different levels in different ways, and make sure that we were flexible enough to remunerate them based on the level of involvement that they wanted. So next slide, please. So I spoke about the VCCC. So this is adapted from their model. So basically they outline the different ways in which consumers can be involved in an organization and as an external consumer, sorry. So there's informing, consulting, there's involving, there's partnership, and there's consumer led. So how do we then take this into our policy? So if we go to the next slide. So we then take those activities, and if you see in the middle column, we clearly outline what that entails. So, if they want to sit on a panel, if they want, for example, we bought, John Chinesky was involved in some videos when he was here in Sydney. So the person that recorded that was a person with lived experience. If we were to engage her again, this policy allows us to pay her for a time and offer a rate as well. The rates determined here in the columns, so they're based on state government figures. So they have an outline for certain pay rates and remuneration for people as honorariums. So next slide, please. So the key points of the policy is that it is flexible. It allows organization to engage external consumers in a variety of roles. The other thing is payments are not mandatory. So, we don't force people to take payment. I definitely encourage them to get paid, but they're not mandatory. Sometimes, people want to just give back to the spinal community. They may be well established and what have you, and they're not interested in payment. But we give them the option. We don't necessarily force them. And a bit to John's point as well, it allows an organization to develop budgets for programs as well. And if I were to put in a grant application for part of my program and I wanted consumer involvement, I would just work out how many hours I think, because I've got the rates, I'm not guessing. I know exactly how much it's going to cost to have consumers involved in the work. So next point. Next slide, please. So the tax implications as well. So this is something that came up in the search. So this is an Australian perspective. So you probably need to do the research in your own jurisdiction. So external consumers are not paid employees. So I'm a paid employee, but the internal consumers are not paid employees for the purposes of tax, and they're engaged in an honorarium capacity. In Australia, the tax department has thought of this, and there is a form that they can submit to the tax department, which means that the terminology they use is they're not developing an enterprise. So it's not a small business. It's a one-off or a periodic thing that isn't regular, and they're receiving payments for. But and it is actually the money is exempt from tax once they submit this form. Next slide, please. Once again, the challenge about loss of earning implications. This is one, as I said, this is a key deterrent. People, and I've seen this over many years, people just don't get involved. It's like, no, if I receive a payment, then I'm going to lose my payments. So we looked into this, and I spoke with funding bodies, and I spoke with people at government and welfare services. So essentially, if they declare their funds, then they will not be out of pocket. So for example, if they're getting $1,000 a fortnight, if we pay them for that fortnight $500, their funding body will top up the rest, so they won't be out of pocket. Now, if they earn over, let's say that $1,000, they won't receive money from their funding body in that period of time, but the fortnight after, their payments start again. So this is something that we really needed to look into, and luckily in Australia, across funding bodies and insurers, this is quite consistent. So this made it a lot easier, that we didn't have to fish around and go, all right, well, if you're with this funding body, then you're not going to get it. If you're with this funding body, you will. So that's one area that there was a lot of consistency. So next slide, please. I guess my tips and advice is to commit organizationally to developing a policy to value consumers. And really, it was easy for me because it was a new program. So I was able to implement it in program development, but obviously, it's never too late to go back and look at this. Do your research into community standards and precedents in consumer remuneration. I think that's really important. And I really looked outside of spinal cord injury. So in areas like cancer, diabetes, and what have you, where they engage consumers quite regularly. develop an understanding of the tax and payment implications. So I wouldn't want the people I'm engaging to do that themselves. You know, I've really looked into that, so I've done the homework for them. So if I'm engaging people, I'm confident that I've got the answers for them. And that point again, so ensure that remuneration is embedded into your program, not just an afterthought. So that takes away that tokenism that, you know, we really speak about. So next slide, please. So the policy is available for download, and it is under Creative Commons, so you're welcome to adapt it to your own organizations if you want. There, I can send out that link, but there's also a QR code there as well. Next slide. And if anyone wants to contact me about it, please feel free. I'm happy to discuss in more detail the process that we went through and the details of implementing this. So that's my presentation, guys. Thank you. Yep.
And here we are. Well, that was a lot, and I want to applaud this group, because I think what you got out there was the best bang for your buck in terms of in terms of an audience, because every single one of these presentations, except for mine, were well prepared, well organized, and frankly, they are great. And you got yourself a plan right now, and this is what I applaud is actually the title of this webinar, When Rubber Hits the Road. It's really about taking theory and actually implementing it practically, and doing all the things that need to be done to make it happen. And really, more importantly, it's all about true partnership and involving the whole community to come together and do this. So again, I want to applaud this panel for coming together, and just want to know, are there any questions out there with regards to our presentation today? And also, while you're thinking about questions, just to let you know that we are going to archive this webinar, and it'll be up on our site in a matter of probably a week or so. Does that sound right, Jess?
Yeah, hopefully, if not by the end of the week, early next week, and the slides will be included in that.
Okay. Well, we're after the hour, and I know many of us have things to do, but I just wanted to thank all of you for joining us today, and especially our panel members for coming together. By the way, this was a great poster at ISCOS, and I'm sure we'll be back by big demand to make a presentation next year, as was our original plan. But it was really great working with all of you, and I look forward to how these programs develop, and really look at you as an audience to help us do that as well, because you are part of our community. We're all one team and one giant partnership to make things better for people at SCI. Thank you. Take care, everybody.